With our responsive breakpoints now defined, let's start to implement them in media queries in our Sass code, so that we can start making the page responsive. And so in this lecture, you're going to learn how to use a powerful Sass mixin to write all our media queries with one single mixin. And in order to do that, you'll learn how to use the content and if Sass directives. And finally, we're going to take advantage of the Chrome DevTools to check out our media queries and responsive designs as we code. So the traditional way that many people, and especially beginners I think, used to write media queries was to simply create another CSS file and then in there simply write a big media query, something like this. So media then max with 600 pixels for example, and then in here we would write our styles like HTML and body, and then all of these other components that we have here. So all of these, for example, we would then copy them and put them here in our huge media query. And we would have one media query per breakpoint basically. But what if there is a better way? What if we could simply add the media query into each of our selector? That would make our life a lot easier, right? So for example, imagine that we want to make our story responsive, for example. Imagine we want to make this one responsive. It would be really useful to simply add a media query, for example, in here, and then do it that way, right? So for example, media query, and then max with 600, like this. And with Sass, we can actually do it this way. Okay, if we would now go ahead and write something in here, for example, with 50% or something like that. And this is just a test, okay, I'm just testing and showing you stuff for now. So if you would write it like this, and then open up our compiled file here, which I think we haven't ever opened up until this point. Okay, so this is our compiled CSS file. All of the CSS that we wrote in the last section is in here. So you wrote an impressive, let's take a look. Wow, all of the CSS code. So you wrote an impressive 765 lines of this compressed CSS code. So this is really a lot. But what I was actually looking for here was the code about the story. So let's take a look where that, here it is. Okay, and here's the code that I just wrote. Okay, and so this is similar to what I showed you in the beginning. So to this one here. So where we have a media query and then in there our selector and then the declaration block, okay? But of course, this here is much simpler because we're not repeating the selector. So we just say that at this max width here, for example, we want the width to change to 50%. Okay, and so that makes it a lot easier. But again, I'm going to delete this now because this was just for testing purposes. So to show you a better way. And so here we could actually do something similar. So something like this. And now instead of repeating the selector here, we could simply go ahead and write font size like 50% or something. Okay, so that would make our life a lot easier. We could then go ahead, write the next one in here. And so in the end, we would end up with a lot of media queries like this. And that's not a problem at all. So having like hundreds of these small media queries or one big one is not really a problem, okay? So don't worry about that one. Now, if you think about it, imagine you would have to write this here, so all of this code here, in all of your selectors. So in all of these files, in all of the elements that you selected and you want to change, you would always have to write this media query. So that would be a lot of work. And even worse, imagine that someday you would decide to just change your breakpoints. So then you would have to go back and change all of these numbers. And so there is an even better way than this. And what we're going to do is to write a mixin. And basically the mixin will do this part here for us. So we'll write a mixin, and that mixin will then paste, basically, will insert this code for us. Okay, so let's try to do that, because that will be the best solution of all. So our Mixins file. So this is the clear fix and the absolute centering that we already have. And we're now going to add something like a media query manager. That's how I like to call it. Now, just to recap our last lecture, let's write actually our breakpoints in here. So opening some comments here. So the ranges we just defined in the last lecture were from 0 to 600 pixel, we had the phone, right? Then from 600 to 900, we had the tablet and portrait mode. And this is just so we don't forget it, okay? From 900 to 1200, we had our tablet in landscape. Align this all nicely. And then from, I think from 1800 up, so 1800 plus, we had something for big screens, so big desktop. Right? Now basically everything that's in between here, so from 1200 going to 1800 is where our normal styles apply. Okay, so remember that this is basically a desktop first approach where our normal styles that we have written so far outside of the media queries are for the desktop, right? So basically these are the styles that apply to this 1200 to 1800 pixel range, okay? And so we're then going to write max width media queries for these three ranges here and a min width media query for this range. And you will see how in a second, okay? So let's then write a mixin. I'm going to call it respond. And let's say I want one for the phone, okay? Then what I'm going to do is to simply write the media query in here. So max width 600 pixels. And then in here should go, of course, the content. Now, how do we actually do that, right? So how do we know that, for example, that the code that we write here, so let's go back to what we had before. Okay, so how do we actually pass this font size 50% into the mixin? Well, there's something called the content directive. And so it's this one. So the content. And this basically allows us to pass a block of code into a mixin. Okay, so we can now use that mixin, respond phone. Okay. So in here we want respond phone and then a font size of 50%, okay? And so this here is basically the content that I pass into the mixin. Okay, and here of course I need to include. And all right. So remember that when we first talked about mixins, I sometimes used to pass arguments into it, right? And then I used the parentheses in order to pass a value into a mixin. But this is different. So here we can pass an entire block of code basically into the mixin. Okay, and we can now go ahead and add more lines in here if we wanted. And then all of that content would be called here add content. Okay, so the content we wrote there will then be put in here, and then the mixin will include this entire code here. So this media query already with the content inside. Okay, so let's compile this, and it actually is already compiled. So let's take a look if this here is the same than this, and it should be, right? So let's open this one again. It should be somewhere here near the top. And here we go. So you see, the first media query is this one here, ending here, and then this one here, which is the exact same thing. Okay, does that make sense? Now we can do even better than this, okay? So I'm going in steps here and showing you the improvements that we do instead of just showing you the final solution. So I think it's more logical for you, and it's better if you really understand where these things come from, okay? So we have a mixin called respond phone. Then we would have to have a mixin called respond tablet portrait, and then one for respond tablet landscape, and so on and so forth. But that's not what we want. We just want one huge mixin which covers all of these cases, okay? So how could we do that? Well, that's why I actually called it Media Query Manager, because that's the mixin that we're gonna write. So this is the first one, and I'm gonna leave it here for now, just for testing purposes. And I'm gonna create a new one. So mixin, and this one I will just call respond. And then the difference is that into this one, we are going to pass a breakpoint. Okay, so a breakpoint in form of a name. Now the names of the breakpoints that I want to pass into here, let's actually write them out here as well. So basically documenting this mix point, and that's a good practice. So breakpoint argument choices. And so the first one I'm simply going to call phone. Then we will have one breakpoint called tab port. Now we could call it tablet portrait, but I don't want to write all that text each time I'm using this mixin. And so I just use a small name, just tab port. Okay. And then tab land for the tablet landscape. And finally, big desktop. So these are the names. All right. And how do we do that now? Well, we already saw the content directive, but there's another directive in Sass that we didn't talk about yet, and that's the if directive. So this is now similar to more advanced programming, and I said that I wouldn't cover the if directive in the course, but actually I need it right now. So what is the if directive? And if you're familiar with some programming language, like JavaScript or something, then you already know what the if statement is. So what an if does is basically it makes a test, and if the result of this test is true, then something happens, okay? But it's easier to actually show it to you in practice. So if the breakpoint is phone, then we want something to happen. And what we want to happen comes here in this curly braces, so in this block here. And that's actually it. So let me recap that. We are going to call this mixin here, we're going to include it, and we will pass a breakpoint. And if that breakpoint that we pass in here is called phone, then what we want to happen is this. And what we want to happen is this exact media query that we had before, right? So for the phone, we have 600 pixels. And so that's the media query that we want to include in that case. Okay, so let's now actually test this as well. And again, I'm going to do it here. So this time it looks a bit different. So include, respond. And now with this argument, I can say that I want a media query for the phone with a font size of 50%. All right, so let's save this and that will compile the code. So let's check it out. And indeed, here it is. So this is the first one and this is the second one, and they are completely identical. So exactly the same, meaning that this actually works. All right. So we now have this mixin which allows us to pass simply the word phone in there, and then it will figure out which media query it will do. Okay. And with that in mind, we can now extend this to all our 4 breakpoints. Right. So we have tab port, we have tab landscape, and we have big desktop. All right. And now these breakpoints here, well, the first one is 600 as we know. So everything from 0 to 600 is for the phone. So max width again asks if the width is less than 600 pixels, right? Remember that from the last lecture? Okay. So for tab port, we then have 900. So for all the width which are less than 900 pixels, okay? Then for the tablet landscapes, we have 1200 pixels, right? So this should apply to all the width that are smaller than 1200, or actually smaller or equal to 1200. And then we have a media query for the big desktop. And when do we want this to happen? Well, we want 1800 plus. So we want this to happen when our width is larger than 1800, right? And so, as we learned in the last lecture, this is a min width media query. So the minimum width at which this will occur is 1800 pixels. And if it's more, then it will happen. And if it's less, then it's not going to happen. Okay. And so that is our media query manager, as I like to call it. Okay. And now just to demonstrate to you that this actually works, let's now include a bunch of these in here. So all of them actually. So we have the phone, we have tablet port, we have tab land, and we have big desktop. Let's just change numbers here, 50, 60, 70, and 80. All right, and so let's check that out again. And indeed, here it is. It's a bit weird with all the spacing, so let's give it some spacing to see it better. But actually, that's what we wrote, okay? So we have a media query just for the HTML with font size 50% for max width 600 pixels. Then we have for 900 pixels with 60%, 1200 pixels 70, and 1800 pixels min width 80%. So that's fantastic. That's a huge step forward over the old way of writing the media queries that I explained to you before. Okay, this is really much better than what we had. Now, just one last thing that I have to change here is actually the pixel unit here. Okay, so we've been talking about pixels here all this time now, but such as in the rest of the page, we're actually not going to use pixels in the media queries here. And that's because if the user changes the default font size in the browser, then the media queries would not be affected by that, right? However, we want them to be affected. So just like before, we use pixels simply to understand what's going on here, but we then use a relative unit that is in the end going to convert to pixel, okay? Now about rems and ems, there's an important particularity about them in media queries. And that's because ems and rems in media queries, they are not affected by our root font size setting, okay? So by this setting here, okay? So they are simply not affected by what we do here in the root font size setting. So what that means is that one rem or one em in a media query is always just equal to the font size which is coming from the browser. And that's by default 16 pixels. But if the user changes it to like 20 pixels, then it will be 20 pixels no matter what we have in our base font definition, okay? Now what we're going to use here is ems and not rems, because rems fail to work as intended in some of the browsers, okay? And so there's been some experiments done by people who understand a lot of all of this. And the conclusion basically is that ems are the best option for media queries, okay? And so that's what we're going to do here. So keeping in mind that one em is 16 pixels, let's now convert all of these here, okay? So basically we say 600 divided by 16, okay? And so we end up with 37.5 em. 37.5 em. But just so we know what it actually is, let's write it here in a comment. So 600 pixels, and the same here, of course, so that when we come here and want to check it out, then we know what we're actually looking at, right? So the same logic with 900, so 56.25, 56.25 em, then 1200 divided by 16 is 75, and now finally 1800 divided by 16 is 112.5. All right, and that's it. So this will be converted to our pixels and will be adapted to the font size that the user set for the browser. So it's a more accessible solution here like this instead of using the pixels. So our mixin or breakpoint manager here is now completed. We can go ahead and delete this one here and here this as well. So just one huge comment here for this entire mixin. Okay, so we can close it and we actually never again have to look at this. Now we're ready to just use it. And let's actually do that for the first time here for the default font size, which translates to 1 rem. And so basically this font size here is what defines the size of our entire layout, right? So remember in the beginning when we first started using rem. Okay, I told you that by using rem, we will make the entire layout of the web page dependent on the font size. And that's a good thing because now in responsive design, we can simply change the font size here, right? And in all of these length, all of these measurements in rem, all of them will scale up or down according to these font size, okay? So that's a huge, huge advantage and time saver. So otherwise, if we had everything in pixels, we would now go ahead and change all of these pixels to smaller numbers. But with this trick, we simply need to increase or decrease the font size here, and then the design will basically shrink. That will of course not be enough to make the page responsive, so there's a lot of stuff we will have to adjust later on, but it's a huge step already and a huge time saver. Okay, so let's now define some font sizes for these 4 media queries. So for these 4 breakpoints. So at the default viewport width, 1 rem is of course 10 pixels. Right? So 1 rem equals 10 pixels, right? That's a calculation we've been doing right in the beginning, where we set that the 10 pixels that we want divided by the default 16 pixels equals 62.5%. So remember that part? So let's now change all of that in the media queries. So imagine that for the landscape tablet, I want 1 rem to be 8. And so 1 rem should be 8 pixels, meaning that I have to do 8 by 16, which is 50%. Okay? So I'm going from 65% to 50%, and then just like that, 1 rem is no longer 10 pixels, but 8 pixels. Okay? And if I then take a look at something here, like maybe this button here, so we have a padding of 4 rem here, which used to be 40 pixels at our default size, but then at a tablet, it will simply become 4 times 8. So 4 times 8 is 32 pixels, and no longer 40. And so everything will decrease as a result of this. Okay? So maybe here in the portrait, I want 1 rem to be 9 pixels. Okay? And well, actually that doesn't make much sense, because the landscape here is bigger, and so the font size should be bigger here. So let's actually put this one here. So this is where we want 50%, and here I want it to be 9 pixels, so 9 divided by 16, and that's 56.25%. So 56.25%. Okay, and then when we have a really big screen, maybe I want 1 rem to be equal to 12 pixels. So scaling the entire design up. And so now we do 12 by 16. So 12 by 16, and that's 75%. And so I'm now increasing my entire design. Okay, now here about the phone. Remember that this media query asks the question if the width is smaller than 600, right? But this next media query here asks the question if the width is lower than 900. And so imagine that the width is 500, and so it would still be less than 900, right? So 500 is still less than 600, but of course also less than 900. And so both of these media queries would apply. And what that means is that I don't really need this one, right? So if I have 50% in this one and in this one, so if they're the same, I don't need this one, because they will both apply. And so one of them is unnecessary, right? So let's simply remove the first one, and that should now work as intended. So let's take a look again at the compiled code here. And yep, here we go. So the portrait tablet, the landscape tablet, and the big desktop. All right. And now it's finally time to take a look at this in our final web page. Okay. And so what we're going to do is to actually use the DevTools here instead of resizing the screen, which isn't the best practice, I would say. So we have something here which is called the toggle device toolbar. And if we click this, then we basically get this responsive screen here. We decrease this down here. Okay, and so we can do it here right inside of these DevTools here. Okay. So let's now really decrease and take a look at what we have here. Oh, you saw that? Here, take a look. Here is the 1200 breakpoint. And as I'm decreasing it now, you see everything decreased a bit, right? So that's great. So it means it's working. And let's now get a bit closer to the next one, which is 900. Well, this time nothing happened. Well, why is that? Let's take a look here. And I see that we have now 2 conflicting media queries here, right? And the one that applies is the 75%. And so, of course, I did it wrong here. Okay, it should be the other way around. right? Because it's the same logic as I explained before. So each time that the tablet portrait media queries apply, the tablet landscape does as well. And so both of them here apply, so these two, and then the last one will be used, right? But that's not what I want. So I just need to put them the other way around, right? And so this one here now asks width less than 900. And remember, this one here asks width less than 600. And now imagine that we have a 500 pixels viewport width. So the first one here would apply, and of course the second one would apply as well. So they would still be conflicting, but the difference is that the smaller media query, so the one for the tablet portrait, is the one that is applying. And that is exactly what I want when the screen is just 500 pixels, right? I don't want the larger media query to apply, but the smaller one. And so this is the order in which we have to put the media queries. Always the larger ones before the smaller ones. And so this will bring me the behavior that I expected. And so, yeah, so now you see the change here and here as well. So 50% is now the current font size. And so you see that this is already working quite well, right? So as we decrease the screen, this keeps decreasing here as well. We can actually put the other one here as well for the phone, just to show it to you. So let me just copy this one here, include phone. So let's put it like really small, like just 30%, okay, which will equal to 0.3 times 16, so 4.8 pixels. Basically one RAM will be 4.8. That's not what we want, of course. And so I'm going to delete it in a second, but just to exemplify this here, okay, so reload everything. And now as we approach 600, you see that everything becomes really small now. So you see, even the button, of course, will reduce its size, right? Okay, so we made everything work. We made this a very nice breakpoint manager, and we also used it for the first time. So that's great. Let's get rid of this one here. And here, of course, this is not right. It's 900 and 1200. But that doesn't change the functionality, obviously. So now after this lecture, I want you to think about this a little bit, to think about why we had to use this order of the media queries and not the other one around. Okay, so I want you to really get a grasp for this material so that we can then move on and really use it here on the rest of the page. Okay, so please go ahead and do that right now, and I'll see you next time.